Hello, thank you for joining today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Matthew. Today we are in chapter 9. We're going to be looking at verses 18 through 26. So go ahead, take your Bibles, open them up to that section so you can follow along with what we're talking about today. Today, when we take a look at that section, we're going to see two stories combined together. All three of the synoptic gospels give us that same story combined together. And it's the story of the synagogue leader whose daughter is dying. And in the middle of that story, it gets separated into two. And in the middle of that story is a story of a woman who's been suffering through a hemorrhaging of blood. And so we see these together, and all three synoptics show these together. However, what's interesting is that Matthew is really going to try to make a single point. Recognize that throughout this whole section, since the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's been trying to show us the power of Jesus. It starts out with his power to heal a leper, and his power to heal from a distance, his power to heal his mother-in-law. We see he has the power over nature, and that he has the power to stop the storms and to calm the water. We see that he had the power to forgive sins and to allow a person to be healed of their sin and to be healed of their physical situation due to their sin. We saw that that Jesus is able to heal demon-possessed people. And so Matthew has been showing us the power of Jesus, one after the other after the other. And that's what his goal is. He really doesn't have much more goal than to show us the power of Jesus. And so here's the same thing. He wants to show us that Jesus has the power to cleanse the unclean and to raise the dead. So those are the stories that we're going to see today. And in like ways as previous stories that were in both Matthew and the other synoptic gospels, we see here that Matthew's account is much shorter. It's much quicker. It's much smaller. I did the math and I added it up, and Mark takes 22 verses to tell these stories. Luke takes 16 verses to tell these stories. Matthew's going to do it and condense it down into 9 verses. So in 9 verses, he's going to tell us the same story. And that's because Matthew's not interested in the conversations that occur. Matthew's not interested in any dialogue. Matthew's interested in telling us this one thing. Jesus has the power. And in the first one, let's look at the synagogue leader first. In both Mark and Luke, we find out that the synagogue leader's name is Jairus. But Matthew doesn't bother with that detail. But we know it is Jairus. But this synagogue leader comes and tells Jesus his daughter is dying to please help him. Jesus agrees to do this. Now, there's some similarities and some differences between the centurion. Remember, the centurion's servant was also dying. And instead of going to the centurion, Jesus heals him from a distance. But remember, that was the centurion's request. The centurion said, you don't have to go to my house. You can do it from here. And I think part of that is because the centurion's Roman, and he knows that the Jewish people would become unclean if they entered into the Roman household. And so the centurion, recognizing Jesus as a Jew, tries to make things easier for him and says, don't go into my house, just do it from here. And Jesus says, I haven't seen so much faith in all of Israel. In this case, the synagogue leader is obviously Jewish. He doesn't have this problem. So Jesus is able to enter into the synagogue leader's home. But the problem is that in this case, the daughter has died. And if Jesus were to touch a dead person, he would be considered ceremonially unclean. There are certain things that make us unclean in the Jewish faith back then, and one of them was touching a dead person. Another one would have been touching a leper or somebody with a skin disease. Jesus didn't worry about that either. And here in this case, even though touching a dead person would have made Jesus unclean, instead of worrying about that, because remember, Jesus isn't worried about the letter of the law, Jesus is worried about the spirit of the law. He knows that when he touches this dead girl, she will come to life. And so Jesus basically takes that which was unclean, the dead body, and makes it clean. And that's what Jesus is able to do. Only God can take what was unclean and make it clean. But Jesus is able to take that which was unclean and make it clean. And so he raises the dead girl from the dead, and she is now alive. So it's a hint of what Jesus is going to do with himself later on. The difference is this dead girl, she comes back to life, but we know that she'll live a regular life and die again. Because all of the resurrections we see in the Bible, except for Jesus, will all die again. But Jesus, he's different. He lives forever because he's in the resurrected body. Now, the second story we see is the one with the blood. Now, she's also unclean because that was part of the ceremonial law. Now, what's the problem with her? She's been unclean for 12 years. That means she hasn't been able to perform sacrifices, which means her sins haven't been forgiven, which means she hasn't been able to worship God. She hasn't been able to go into the temple. People can't touch her because if they touch her, they become unclean. So she's basically looked at as a leper. Don't come near me. Don't touch me. I don't want to touch you. And she's been dealing with this for 12 years. This one, Jesus calls his daughter. And again, we don't see the conversations that Jesus has with her, except for one thing. In Mark and Luke, we'll see the conversations, but Matthew has one thing he wants to show us. And that is that Jesus says, your faith has made you well. We recognize that it is by faith that we have access to the grace of God. Jesus gives this healing not because of anything she's done, not because of who she is, but just through grace, but because of her faith. It is by faith that we receive the grace of God. And so here we see that Jesus is able to cleanse her as well, and that which was unclean is no longer unclean, but it is clean. And so that's what we see. Jesus cleaning the unclean, cleansing the unclean, Jesus raising the dead. Matthew wants us to see that the power of God is in Jesus. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, put them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you for being with me. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you.